Thank you. Thank you very much and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to Thresehold of Hope, program where we bring you the writings of the church. And because we're still in the year of faith that Pope Emeritus Benedict had decreed, we're going through a document by John Paul II known as Fides Et Ratio, which means faith and reason. So we'll take a look at it. Now you can get a paperback copy of Fides Et Ratio by going to the Daughters of St. Paul website, which is www.pauline.org. And they have an online store, and just type in Fides Et Ratio and you can order it. Also, if you want, you can get a free electronic copy of Fides Et Ratio, and that's in the document library at our website, EWTN.com. Just go to where it says faith. You'll see it, the array includes document library, and then type in Fides Et Ratio, and you can go there, as well as when you're at the website, check out past programs. Go to where it says live shows, and then click on Thresehold, and you can see where we have been so far. Now, of course, we want you to be involved and participate in our show. You can do what all these nice people have done on this pretty day in Alabama, which is to come here to our studios in Irondale, right next to Birmingham. Another way is to send us your questions by through email by writing to thresehold@EWTN.com, or you can call us during the live broadcast. Now, the live broadcast is at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and on Tuesdays. So if you call then, the number is 1-800-221-9460. Or you can also, if you're here in Birmingham, or if you're outside the country, you can call 205-271-2980. And from outside America, the country code is 1. One time I was in Australia about 18 years ago. About that now. No, 19 now. And like I said, you mean America is number one for that? You guys are first in that too? I said, we invented it. So we got to be number one. That's how we have the number one code. All right, we are on paragraph 4.3 in Fides Et Ratio. Now, the Pope brings up an important point. Times change. And with the changing of different times, of course, language changes. Cultural styles change in many ways. There are all sorts of changes like that. And there's also an increase of knowledge overall. Not always. Sometimes there's a decrease in knowledge. As, say, when the barbarians invaded Europe, they oftentimes destroyed much of the knowledge that was around. But in general, there's an increase of knowledge, and certainly in the modern world, we've seen that increase tremendously in my own lifetime. And therefore, we have to pay attention to those changes. But at the same time that there are changes and developments, we also need to pay attention to the fact that there is a core of thought that persists across cultures and across times. For instance, there are certain principles of thinking, not just individual ideas, but principles by which we think. and that these principles last through time and culture. The most basic is the principle of non-contradiction. Now, if you don't hold this, you will not be able to think. It's absolutely basic. What non-contradiction means is that something cannot be a certain thing and at the same time not be that thing. So, I can't say this is a cup and then logically say it is not a cup. Right? Wouldn't be logical. And I can't say this is a desk, but it's not a desk. Now that's just wouldn't be logical. That would be contradicting myself. And in fact, looking for contradictory statements is precisely the way you catch criminals or little boys stealing cookies. How did I ever learn that? You know that you find out. When somebody changes their story, and you can't say that it's true, and at the same time the facts are the opposite. This is something that we must pay attention to. Now you can't say somebody may have thought that this was true at one time, and then show them the contrary data. But then if they see the data, they must accept the data that is factual, so they don't contradict themselves. And certainly one of the things that we do is check for contradictions among various public figures in the way they speak and act. We look for that because we want, we know contradicting yourself, not just holding two ideas that are close but different, but actually contradicting yourself. That's where you are dealing with something that is illogical. And so you want to get past the illogic of self-contradiction. It's very basic. It's, in fact, the most basic principle that you learn when you learn how to think. A second principle is finality. This is denied by many modern people today. Finality means that it comes from the Latin word finis, which means end. And the idea is that the various objects that exist have an end or a purpose. This is very logical. So, for instance, I don't swallow marbles into my stomach because the finality of my stomach is to digest food. Marbles cannot be digested by my stomach. So I don't eat marbles. That goes against the finality, that is the purpose of my stomach. And, we also learn to think more and more carefully about the various things we have. Not only in the body, that the eyes are oriented towards seeing. They're not meant to help us hear. That's not their final purpose. The ears and the eardrum are meant to help us hear. And understanding the purpose of things is very important for survival. But also, of course, having that idea of finality is very important for asking the most basic questions about life itself. Why am I alive? Why do human beings exist? Why does the world exist? These are more important questions about finality. But we start as small children of learning that hands are meant to hold spoons that are meant to get food to your mouth so it goes in your stomach and you don't feel hungry anymore. You learn very basic ideas of finality. Spoons work for throwing food farther across the room, but that's not the final purpose. And then the spoons sometimes, as I recall, can have another purpose, which is on the backside of a little baby that throws the food across the room. You know, you can change the finality sometimes, but you know, the primary purpose is what you want to look for, and that's the same thing with human life. You want to find out the final purpose of life. Another principle that's very basic is causality. Certain events cause other events. Now, you know, if I were to play billiards and have a cue stick and hit the cue ball that is well aimed at another of the balls on the billiard table, it will hit that other ball and cause it to move in a certain direction. That's why you play billiards. Now, again, this is also under a certain amount of assault as an idea by some philosophers. There was a Scotsman named David Hume who lived in the 1700s, and he denied that there was any causality. He said, oh, sure, this time, and he used the example of the billiard ball. That's why I started with it. I'm not particularly good. I'm not horribly bad at it, but I'm not particularly good at pool and billiards. But David Hume used the billiard table. And he said, when I take the cue ball and hit, or the cue stick and hit the cue ball, and it hits another ball and it moves, I cannot prove that the motion of the cue ball against the other billiard ball is what made it happen. All that David Hume was willing to say is that this time I hit it and then it changed. But he didn't want to say it as a principle because he couldn't prove the principle of causes. And since someone as smart as he couldn't prove it, therefore it may not exist. That was his idea. Now, this leads to all sorts of problems, you know, in the way people think. If you don't see a link between what my behavior is and the effects that result, and I don't link them and say, when I drink too much alcohol, it will cause me to get drunk. If I don't see that there's a logical causality, I may continue to drink again and again and not make the link between my bad behavior of getting drunk and the hangover. Or, and this is very common, now that's generally most drunks know the connection. And that's why they keep drinking the next day, because they prevent the hangover by having another drink. They know that. But there are certain criminals who do not see a causal link between their bad behavior and why they should go to jail. One policeman told me something very interesting. When you have a lineup of possible criminals. And you line them up and have the witness come there. He said, you know how he can spot who it is? It's the guy who falls asleep and is just sitting there resting. The people who are not guilty are nervous that they might get incorrectly chosen. But the sociopath has no guilty conscience and sees no causal link between his behavior and his bad effects. So he'll fall asleep and be totally relaxed. So that's how the cop can find him. And he says that that's not universal, but when you're dealing with a sociopath, it's a good clue because they don't see a causal link. But that's not good sense. That's why we call them sociopathic. That they don't understand how their behavior is a bad link to the rest of society. Okay? So these three are basic principles. You can't contradict, say something is and at the same time is not something. You can't say that there's no purpose to things, and you don't deny that there's a cause between certain events. What you do is try to refine your understanding of these different points. You can learn more about what causes what and why. And you can learn more about the final purpose of things. And that's part of the process of increasing knowledge. But the basic principles belong to the whole human race. No matter what country you go to, if you are an innocent person and you get arrested, you will immediately appeal to them and say, I didn't do anything wrong. And you will say that expecting that they'll make a logical link that if I didn't do anything wrong, I did not cause this bad behavior. Therefore, you should let me go. Everywhere you go in the world, your people will say that. So that's something that's very important. Another basic principle. These are the three principles of logic, but now principles of what it means to be human. First, that human persons have intelligence. The level of intelligence varies over time in a person. Small children grow in intelligence, and sometimes when we become elderly, we can get something like Alzheimer's disease and lose our ability to be intelligent. That happens. You can have dementia and get worse, but you'd still have logic and intelligence as what it means to be a human. Secondly, because you have intelligence, you are able to know the choices that exist in the world. Because you know that there are different options open to you, then you can have free will that chooses to follow those options. So being intelligent and then having free will are two essential components of human beings that distinguish us from the animals. So it's very common that I'll be sitting in a chair reading a book, and my cats will come right over to the book, not because they are intelligent enough to read it, but because they want to scratch their ear on the edge of the book. That's what they see with a book, something that they can rub their ear against rather than something they will ever read and learn from. I, on the other hand, don't scratch my ear with my books, but I read them. And then, of course, they are this intelligent. They know that if they keep scratching their ear on my book, that they know I will become just enough annoyed that I will scratch their ear and continue reading my book without them pushing it around. They're not totally dumb. Another aspect of that is that because we are intelligent and have free will, we have the capacity to know God. A lot of people deny that God exists, but we do have the capacity to know Him. Of course, you have to start off with believing in His existence, but you can know Him. Also, you can know what is true, and you can love truth and goodness for their own sake. You can also love facts and information for your sake. That's why G.K. Chesterton had a wonderful line. He says, most people use statistics the way a drunk uses a light post. It's for support rather than illumination. And that, and again, we'll see, certainly as we watch various political dramas take place, we'll see how politicians will use the information they can gather and their statements, not necessarily for the truth in itself, but for how it will protect them to keep their jobs or help them get somebody else's job. That's the way they may use it. But we do have the capacity to know what is true in and of itself and what is good in and of itself, not what just is useful for me. So we want to think about some of the moral norms that the whole world shares. Nobody likes to be robbed. There's no culture that say, oh, you robbed me. Isn't that wonderful? What a good person. Now, Spartan culture used to encourage you to become a thief so you could get away with it in order to be a clever soldier. But if you robbed them and got caught, they punished you. So they didn't like getting robbed, but they didn't mind teaching their boys to be robbers. So that's something inconsistent. Because if you teach somebody else to rob, why do you accept yourself? Again, nobody wants to be murdered. You may choose to be a murderer, but if you try to kill a killer, they get pretty mad at you. And if you miss, they'll get you back. That's a basic principle. Nobody likes to be lied to. You may think you can get away with a lie, but you don't want to have somebody lie to you. Basic human principles. And so these are something shared by all the human race, along with some others, but these are the clearest. And these are some of the indications that there is a body of knowledge that is a certain spiritual heritage of the whole human race. Sure, we have differences of culture and nuances, and those are oftentimes wonderful. But there is a common spiritual and intellectual heritage that belongs to the human race. And that's what he calls an implicit philosophy. You may not go to college. You may not finish 8th grade, but you still have the basics of philosophy. You still know. Don't hit your finger with a hammer because of the principle of causality. It causes me to have pain. And there are all sorts of very common sense things that people know, no matter how well or poorly educated you are in school. You still can figure out a lot of things. Matter of fact, sometimes there are certain people who go to school so long, they don't even have that much common sense. They can talk themselves out of it. So we call being educated beyond your intelligence. But that's another problem. And what we want is to make sure that everybody has a sense of possessing these principles. It belongs to all of us. And it may be unreflected, it may be in a general way, you just take it for granted. By unreflected, it means you just take it for granted to be logical. Until somebody like David Hume says, you can't prove logic, therefore I don't believe in it. Because of course, he does get at a core issue. And I'll grant, he sets up a problem that you cannot prove that logic is logical. Can't. Because you have to use logic to do so. And that's why he was frustrated. I can't use logic to prove logic, because that goes against the rules of logic. And what he did not want to do is to take the most obvious and logical step, which is to admit, like philosophers like Michael Polanyi have done, you take logic as an act of faith. Same thing with the principle of non-contradiction. You believe that that is basic. Can't prove it. And the same thing with finality. You can't prove finality exists. You take it on an act of faith. And this is going to be one of the themes I want us to understand. At core, the basis of logic is an act of faith in logic. You trust that logic is logical, and it works out pretty well. You believe as an act of faith that science is scientific, but you can't prove it scientifically. So you believe in it, and that's good faith. It's good to believe in science, but there's a point at which you have to accept this is a basic set of acts of faith in logic. And perhaps we may even begin to see that having faith in logic is also going to be something of a basis for faith in the God who created logic and humans who can be logical. So, we want to use these basic principles, non-contradiction, causality, finality, these basic issues that are the way human beings think, as a point of reference for all philosophical schools. We will judge the various philosophies by these principles to see if they're logical or not. And once reason successfully intuits and formulates the first universal principles of being and correctly draws from them certain conclusions by using logic, conclusions that are coherent, that is, they make sense, they fit together. We should think of life as being like a puzzle. I think that's one of the reasons people enjoy jigsaw puzzles. You see how all the pieces fit. And a key element of becoming mature is to see how the pieces of life fit together. That's one of the joys of getting older. It starts to make more sense than it did when you were younger. And you only learn that by experience. And when you do that in a logical way, that you're coherent, and ethically, because there's a way to be coherent logically, but to be unethical. For instance, the Nazis accepted certain principles of racism as being scientific. They were using Charles Darwin's second book, The Descent of Man. And in that book, it said that certain races are not even human. For instance, Darwin taught Africans are a species in between the ape and the human being. And then the Nazis applied this to Jews and gypsies. And so if they're a subhuman species, then you can eliminate them. Now that's logical once you accept those principles. But it is unethical and, of course, untrue. It wasn't true to begin with. Darwin was wrong. He didn't know that Africans have the same DNA as all the other humans of the other races. They have a DNA and a mind and a spirit and a free will of equality with all other people, and that there's no difference. And they are not a different species. But Darwin didn't know how to detect differences in species through DNA, because the Augustinian priest who invented the science of genetics didn't know about DNA either. That would take till the 1960s or 50s or 60s before that was discovered. And so on the basis of a false principle, the Nazi system was logical, it was coherent, but immoral and incorrect. So this is going to be, again, part of the task of using minds that the beginnings of genetics by an Augustinian priest in Austria is going to lead to the discovery of DNA and so much else. But we learned more. But we have to make sure that as we make decisions, we are ethical. It's one of the reasons why we do not permit the use of stem cells from infants, because we have to kill them. That is logical to use their DNA, or their stem cells, it seems, but it is unethical. So even if something seems logical, if it's unethical, we may not do it. Just because they're small enough. That was the case for the Jews in Europe and the gypsies. They were weak as a group politically compared to the Nazi Party. But it was unethical to kill them. These are principles we must keep together. And then, of course, one of the great things we've been discovering is that the embryonic stem cells don't bring any cures at all. They don't work. But adult stem cells do cure people. So the billions of dollars that the state of California offered in order to pay for embryonic stem cell research was immoral and bad science, as it turns out. Even if it was good scientifically, it would still be immoral. We can't agree with it. And it's applying these different principles together that we must do. That's why the Pope talks about how we have to have right reason. What he calls, in Greek, orthos logos. Orthos, like in orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and so on, means right in Greek. Or in Latin, recta ratio, right reason. Right reason means that you use the principles of logic correctly and ethically. Both go together. And that is going to be the approach that we want to take to everything around us. Understanding human core principles of thought applied logically and ethically. And we want to deal with that discussion, that engagement with everyone else, so that we can do this not just by what I say is right, but what is right by norms of truth and goodness. That's the issue. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back in a couple minutes. We want to get questions from our studio audience as well as you in our live audience. So please stay with us. Welcome back. We have a wonderful audience here and from different parts of the country, and we'd love to have you come and join us as well. Isn't the weather beautiful out here today? It's just really nice. This is a very, very pleasant spring. Matter of fact, usually by now we're talking about summertime, but it's still like spring here. So if you get a chance, come and join us. The phone number of our pilgrimage department is 205-271-2966. Or you can also go online, www.EWTN.com, and they'll help you with knowing the schedule of masses, programs, or you can be in the audience, and places to stay, all that kind of information. So, and we have a couple folks who came here all the way from Great Britain. And, you know, you have to try some of our Alabama food. You know, get you some fried green tomatoes, Alabama barbecue, and even the foreigners from the Republic of Texas need to try some Alabama barbecue. All right, let's start off with the caller. Hello, Agnes?
Yes.
Hi, where are you from?
New Jersey.
Great. And what's your question?
I'd like proof from the Bible that life after death comes when we die, and not after the second coming of Christ. And another one, proof again from the Bible of the existence of hell, and not where it's called Gehenna, because some people dispute that Gehenna is hell. They say it's a place in Jerusalem.
Okay, now first of all, Agnes, stay with me a second, okay? Now, just in terms of Gehenna, you know, some people, are you talking to people from the Jehovah's Witnesses?
Yes, it's actually my daughter that talks to them, but yes.
All right, good. And I'm going to give you the name of an author that you need to take a look at, because you'll have a lot of other issues. Because Jehovah's Witnesses follow the church called the Seventh-day Adventists, who follow Ellen Gould White in denying that hell is perpetual. Now, the word Gehenna does mean in Hebrew, well, actually that's an Aramaic form, the valley of Hinnom, which is a valley that goes from the west side of Jerusalem around to the south side and then across the whole south end of Jerusalem. And it was used as a garbage dump. However, I've been to Gehenna many times. As a matter of fact, not only have I been there, but a lot of rock and roll stars have played at an auditorium in Gehenna. So they've already been there too. But one of the things that, in terms of the logic that your daughter can use with these folks, is that Gehenna, that is the place in Jerusalem, the fire has gone out. There's no fire in Gehenna anymore. It's not a garbage dump anymore. In fact, it's a park. It's a very nice park. You can go for very pleasant walks. And so when Jesus, our Lord, says that you'll end up in Gehenna, where the worm dies not and the fire dies not. Right? So when he says that the fire and the worm don't die in the Gehenna he's talking about, it cannot mean the Gehenna as the garbage dump in Jerusalem, because that fire has gone out. But he speaks of one that doesn't go out. So this would not be logical on their part. Secondly, in terms of life in heaven after you die, but before the second coming, that's another one of their things. They say, oh, you fall asleep. Now, they are taking words from the New Testament where they spoke about death as falling asleep, because that was the common idiom for dying. A lot of us don't like to say that somebody is dead, that they're passing away. We use the word pass away. We'll sometimes say a lot of idioms that are not as nice, such as bought the farm, kicked the bucket, and things like that. Okay? Now, those are not as nice, but those are all euphemisms for saying that they're dead. That's exactly the way falling asleep was used. However, I would ask you and your daughter to take a look at the book of Revelation, chapter 7, where you see that the souls of the martyrs are in heaven speaking to our Lord Jesus. And they say to him, how long before you avenge the death of the martyrs? Now, this means that they are very much alert and alive in heaven. Secondly, they are aware that the Lord has not avenged their death as martyrs, so they know what's going on earth. And the Jehovah's Witnesses don't know how to deal with that. And then just so that you start to put them a little bit on the defensive, take a look. If you have a concordance, it'll be easy to do this. Look in the book of Revelation, one of the favorite books, and you'll see that God calls himself the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, right? Now, when you have a beginning and an end, there's only one beginning and one end, right? Makes sense? However, point out to them that in chapter 22 of the book of Revelation, Jesus Christ also calls himself the Alpha and the Omega. So, how can it be that God is the Alpha and the Omega in Revelation 1 and a couple other times, and that twice in the book of Revelation, Jesus Christ calls himself the Alpha and the Omega? Are there two beginnings, or is Jesus Christ God? They won't like that question, and you keep asking it, and I guarantee you they won't come back. They won't come back because they don't have an answer to that. And then one last one on them. They like to say from Revelation 7 that only the 144,000 are in heaven, right? Now, here's one of the things. That it mentions the 144,000 twice in Revelation. First, they are from the 12 tribes of Israel. So they have to be all Israelites, 12,000 from each tribe. Therefore, none of the Gentiles among the Jehovah's Witnesses or anywhere else can be among that group. Secondly, if you look at chapter 14 and 15 of Revelation, you'll also see that the 144,000 are A, all men, and B, they're virgins. So you have 144,000 virgin men from the tribes of Israel. How does that fit even the leadership of the witnesses? Because, by the way, they believe that the 144,000 were closed off in 1935. Nobody baptized after 1935 can be in the 144,000. And they believe that everybody else is part of the great crowd here on earth. And that's what they're going to try and teach you, that it's the great crowd here on earth. However, again, take them to Revelation 19, where he says, I heard the great crowd in heaven. Now, their organization says the great crowd is on earth. The Bible says the great crowd is in heaven. Who are you going to believe? Amen? Baptist group today. Oh, I have a question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
Originally Chicago.
Good to have you here. And what's your question?
I'd like you to explain intelligent design based on the principles you've explained so far today.
Okay, so the principle of intelligent design, and again, there are a variety of theories about this and different nuances. But the basic starting point is there was a Big Bang. Now, this is what physicists hold today. And in fact, the Big Bang theory was something that was deduced by a Jesuit priest, Father Lemaitre, a Belgian Jesuit. And, this means that there was an enormous explosion that is everything. Now, here's one of the issues, is that in the universe, there are a number of constants that make the universe as we know it possible, such as the speed of light being a constant, and the force of gravity and others. And that these constants apply everywhere in the universe. And if any one of these approximately 20, I think there's 16 or 20 of these constants, if any one of them was off by 0.0 to the something like a 10,000th or 100,000th, and even more difference from what any one of them were, it couldn't be. So how is it that all the constants and all of them together were put in an explosion? If it were just a random explosion, you would not logically expect that these constants would all be coordinated to make up the universe. And then, of course, the existence of the periodic table of the elements, by which there's an orderly progression of the elements of the universe that are everywhere in the universe. How can these things be unless a mind greater than the universe designed the Big Bang in such a way that this could happen, and that eventually life could come to exist on a planet, about 2/3 out from the center of the Milky Way, which is a phenomenal location. See, this is one part of it, that human beings live on a planet going around a sun 2/3 out of the Milky Way. If we were farther in the Milky Way, the light from all the other stars would block out the universe. But we're at a place far enough out that we can see the rest of the universe. It's amazing. So that the intelligent species that we know exists is able to observe all this and have a mind by which it can put things together. So this doesn't seem to be an accident. Whereas, if you hold the theory that it is all by accident, this is just a series of events that were, one accident caused another, and all happened by accidents, then you have to take and apply that same principle to the theorist. In other words, and this is what I'm going to tell you this, atheists never want you to apply their theory to themselves. So that if everything is an accident, that means their theory that everything is an accident is an accidental theory. They didn't have a good enough breakfast that day. Their mama didn't raise them right. The daddy spanked them too hard, and they came up with this theory. It's just an accident of history. Oh, no, it's logical. No, you are conditioned by your environment to think it's logical. You see, if you hold that theory that's all accident, you've got to apply it to the theorist. And they don't like that at all. So, of course, I do it all the more. Let's take another question.
Yes, Father Mitch, I'd like your comments on this. The great principles, and I recall learning these principles in elementary school.
Sure.
Okay? But it seems that today, as adults, we leave these principles in a basket as we walk into a voting booth to choose our leadership.
Right. And it's not only when we choose our leadership, we take our principles and put them aside when we watch movies, much of television, and especially entertainment. And we put it aside when it comes to what we hear our children or grandchildren being taught in the government-run schools. And the point that the Pope is saying is we must not compartmentalize our ability to think to only one or two areas of life, but bring it to the voting booth, the schoolroom, the media, the television, the movies. Think logically and use these principles, so otherwise you will be tricked. And this is something, especially in the United States, which is a democracy, a Republican democracy, we cannot afford to allow ourselves to be ignorant and unthinking. Because once that happens, other people will get control on either side. There are people on either side of the political spectrum who want control because they think in terms of getting control over other people's lives. That's liberals and conservatives alike. And we must act on principle of what is true and good and apply that no matter how much you like a politician. And you feel, oh, this one is so great. Does not matter. You analyze everything by if it's true and good. These are questions that we have to bring. But one of the things that is certainly true is, and many people think it's good too, we've run out of time. So, the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. You know, we can do these programs and all the other shows that we do because of your generosity. This is your network. You make it possible. So please keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill, and we will pay all of our bills.